Deathworlder first aid shocks alien students, human methods leave the galaxy speechless. Part 1, The New Exchange Student. The hallways of the Unity of Minds were wide enough to fit 6 humans walking side by side, which was good, because the ship carried students from 47 different species and some of them were very large. The ceiling glowed with soft blue light that shifted slowly throughout the day, mimicking the gentle cycle of a calm sky. The floors were smooth and dark. The air smelled of nothing in particular, which the designers had done on purpose, since 47 species could not agree on what a good smell was. Colin Drake walked through those hallways on his first morning with his duffel bag on one shoulder and his water bottle hanging from his fingers. He had a plain face, short brown hair, and the kind of easy walk that made it look like he had been there before. He had not. He was reading the signs on the walls as he moved, turning left and right without slowing down, and occasionally sipping from his water bottle as if he had nowhere urgent to be. Around him, students moved out of the way. Not because he asked them to. Not because he was loud or aggressive or took up too much space. They moved because he was human, and on the Unity of Minds, the word human carried a particular weight. Everyone knew what humans were. Everyone had read the reports. Earth was not a normal planet. Earth was a place where the gravity was high, the weather was violent, the animals were dangerous, and somehow, against all reasonable expectation, a species had grown up there, learned to use tools, built cities, developed science, and then launched themselves into space with the same casual energy that most species reserved for short walks. Humans were Deathworlders. That was the word the galaxy used. Not as an insult. More as a warning. Colin did not seem to know this, or if he did not care. He found his assigned room, dropped his bag on the smaller of the 2 sleeping platforms, looked around at the walls and the low table and the narrow window that looked out into the dark of space, and nodded once as if approving. Then he sat down, pulled out a worn paperback book, and began to read. His assigned academic partner was waiting outside in the corridor. The partner's name was Zeal. Zeal was Vethery, which meant he was roughly the height of a human but built differently, 4 arms, pale gray skin, large dark eyes that could see well in low light, and a way of holding very still when thinking that made him look like a statue. Zeal had requested a human partner. His research project was on comparative species biology, and humans were by far the most interesting subject available. He had been pleased when the request was approved. He was slightly less pleased now that the moment had actually arrived. He knocked on the door. Colin opened it, saw him, and smiled. Most species in the galaxy showed friendliness in different ways. Vethery pressed the backs of their hands together. Croth lowered their upper limbs. Sulci dimmed their bioluminescent patches to a soft yellow. Humans showed teeth. Zeal knew this. He had studied it. And yet, standing in front of a human who was showing him a full set of flat white teeth in what he understood to be a gesture of warmth and welcome, some very old and very quiet part of Zeal's brain sent up a small flare of alarm. He pressed the backs of his hands together and said, in the common tongue, "You are Colin Drake." "I am Zeal. We have been paired for the semester." "Good to meet you," Colin said, and stepped aside to let him in. Zeal entered carefully and looked around the room. Colin had already placed a few small items on the low table, the paperback book, a folded piece of cloth that might have been a shirt, a small rectangular device that was clearly some kind of personal tool, and a compact kit with a red symbol on the front that Zeal did not immediately recognize. "What is that?" Zeal asked, pointing to the kit. "First aid kit," Colin said. "I travel with one." "You believe you will be injured here?" Colin shrugged. "I don't believe anything. I just like having it." Zeal wrote that down in his journal. He had brought the journal specifically for observations. The first entry was a single line, "Subject travels with medical supplies as a personal habit." Not issued. Not required. Voluntary. The first week passed in a way that Zeal found increasingly difficult to categorize. Colin was, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly pleasant person. He was polite. He listened when others spoke. He asked questions in class that were thoughtful and sometimes caught the professor off guard. He helped a Croth student named Duro carry equipment to the upper storage level without being asked, apparently simply because Duro was struggling with the load and Colin had noticed. But there were things about him that Zeal could not entirely reconcile with his understanding of how living creatures behaved. The temperature of the ship was kept at 22 degrees Celsius. This was considered comfortable by most of the student body. Colin called it a little chilly, and sometimes wore an extra layer. When Zeal pointed out that 22 degrees was well within normal habitable range, Colin agreed and said he ran cold. He said it the way someone might comment on preferring one type of food over another. Not as a complaint. Just as information. One afternoon, a heavy metal cabinet fell from a shelf in the shared study room. It fell because a Croft student had bumped it with one of his upper limbs. It landed with a sound that made every student in the room jump, flinch, or emit some kind of startled noise. Zeal himself scrambled backward 2 full steps. Colin, who had been sitting closest to the cabinet, looked at it, looked at the Croft student, and picked it up. He set it back on the shelf, pushed it back slightly so it would not fall again, and sat back down. "Sorry," the Croft student said. "No problem," Colin said, and went back to his reading. Zeal wrote in his journal, "Subject did not flinch at loud sudden impact." Either his auditory response is slower than average, or he has simply been in the presence of sudden loud events often enough that they no longer register as threats. He paused, then added, "The second option is deeply unsettling." By the end of the second week, the rest of the class had begun to notice similar things. A Veterinary student named Sue had seen Colin eat something from his personal bag that he described as leftovers from the cafeteria, and when she asked what it was, he described its contents casually, including 2 items that she later looked up and discovered were derived from animals that Earth biologists had classified as moderately dangerous. Colin had eaten them cold, from a small container, while reviewing lecture notes. A Sulkai student in a sealed environmental suit had asked Colin why humans did not use sealed suits for daily activities, given the variety of pathogens present in a shared air system. Colin had said that Earth had plenty of pathogens too, and that his immune system was used to working for a living. The Sulkai student had reported this exchange to his academic advisor with a note that read, "I do not know if the human was joking. I do not think he was joking." Duro, the Croft cadet, had developed something close to open admiration. He had told 3 of his classmates that Colin reminded him of a senior warrior back home, not in size or appearance but in the specific quality of not being bothered by things that should bother someone. Zeal watched all of this and kept writing. His journal was already 12 pages long and the semester had barely started. On the last night of the second week, Colin sat across from Zeal in the common room after dinner and asked how the research project was going. Zeal considered the question honestly. "I expected to study you," he said. "I did not expect to find studying you this complicated." Colin looked curious. "Complicated how?" "You behave as though the universe is not particularly dangerous," Zeal said. "And yet you also carry a medical kit everywhere you go and you know how to use it. These 2 things do not fit together in my mind." Colin thought about this for a moment. "Where I'm from," he said, "the universe is dangerous. That's why we carry the kit." Zeal wrote that down, slowly and carefully, and underlined it. Outside the window, the stars moved past in long pale lines as the ship continued on its course toward the next semester, carrying 47 species and 1 increasingly well-documented human through the quiet dark of space. #Deathworlder First Aid shocks alien students, human methods leave the galaxy speechless. Part 2, the incident in Lab 7. Lab 7 was one of the larger practical rooms on the Unity of Minds. It had long white work surfaces running down both sides, a row of equipment lockers along the back wall, and a ceiling that was just a little higher than the rest of the ship to allow for the larger students who needed the extra space. The lighting was bright and even. The air was filtered and clean. Professor Valai had taught in Lab 7 for 11 years and had never had a serious incident. That record ended on a Thursday. The class that morning was a joint session between the Xenobiology group and the Practical Emergency Theory students. There were 22 students in the room, from 9 different species. Professor Valai, a Marishi, 6-armed, gray-robed, with the kind of calm face that came from 4 decades of teaching, had them working on a simulation exercise. The scenario was a theoretical planetary surface emergency. They were supposed to review charts, discuss response options, and write up a brief plan. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. The ceiling in Lab 7 had a network of coolant lines running through it. These lines were old. They had been flagged for maintenance twice in the past year. The maintenance had been scheduled, then pushed back again because the ship's technical team was busy with a more urgent system on the lower decks. This was a small, forgettable administrative failure. It became less forgettable at 9:47 in the morning when one of the lines gave way. The sound was sharp and sudden, a crack, followed immediately by a loud hiss. A pressurized spray of coolant burst from the ceiling in the far left corner of the room. The liquid was not toxic, but it was close to freezing in temperature and it contained chemical stabilizers that were harsh on organic tissue. It hit the corner in a wide, fast-moving cloud that caught 3 students before anyone had time to react. The first was Prith, a Sulkai student in a full-sealed environmental suit. The suit held. He was knocked sideways by the force of the spray but otherwise unhurt. The second was Duro, the Kroth cadet, who had been standing near the equipment lockers. Duro was large and strong and had good reflexes, but the floor under the spray turned slick in less than a second, and his back foot went out from under him. He fell sideways and hit the floor hard, and one of his secondary limbs, the lower left, which the Kroth used for lifting and stabilizing, bent at an angle that it was not designed to bend at. The sound it made was not a good sound. Several Vethri students emitted the high-pitched distress frequency that was their species' involuntary response to witnessing injury. The third was Lena Ortiz. Lena was a human, a second-year student, and she had been standing closest to the rupture. The spray caught her left arm directly, dissolving the sleeve of her jacket within a few seconds and leaving the skin underneath red and burning. She was also the first one back on her feet. Professor Valai began reciting emergency protocol. His voice was steady and authoritative. The protocol was clear: clear the area of the chemical source, move injured parties away from the spray, contact the ship's medical response team, wait for trained personnel to arrive. Estimated arrival time for the medical team was 11 minutes. 11 minutes was the standard response window. It had been set by the Galactic Medical Standards Committee based on average travel times across ships of this class. It was considered acceptable. Colin Drake did not find it acceptable. He had his duffel bag open before anyone else in the room had stopped staring at the ceiling. He moved to Lena first. Not because she was human, but because she was standing, conscious, and could tell him what she felt. He crouched in front of her, looked at her arm, and spoke quietly and directly. "Does it burn?" "Yes," she said. "Anywhere else?" "No. Just the arm." He pulled his water bottle from the side pocket of his bag. It was large, nearly a full liter, and he kept it full, and told her to hold her arm out. He poured the water slowly and steadily over the exposed skin, flushing the chemical away from the surface. Then he pulled a clean cloth from his kit, folded it into a thick pad, and laid it against her forearm. He stripped off his own outer jacket without pausing, tore a long strip from the sleeve with his hands, and used it to secure the pad firmly in place. "Hold that above your heart," he said. "Keep the pressure on. Don't let it drop." Lena nodded and raised her arm. Colin stood up and turned to Duro. The Kroth cadet was enormous, nearly 2 meters tall, even lying on his side, heavy with the dense muscle structure that Kroth developed from early physical training. He was conscious but making a low, resonant sound that his translator rendered as experiencing significant structural failure. His bent limb was visible from across the room, and 2 Vethri students near the wall had turned away from it. Colin knelt beside him. He did not look at the bent limb first. He looked at Duro's eyes. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," Duro said. "I'm not going to move you. I'm just going to look. Can you tell me where else it hurts?" Duro reported his shoulder and lower back. Colin checked both carefully, pressing lightly with his fingers, watching Duro's face for reaction. Then he looked at the limb. He did not make a noise or a face. He just looked at it the way someone looks at a problem they are trying to solve. "I'm going to hold it still," he said. "I'm not going to fix it. Just keep it from moving more." "Okay." "Okay," Duro said. Colin used both hands to brace the limb gently in its current position. He looked up at the circle of alien students who had gathered and were standing in a wide ring, watching him with a variety of expressions that ranged from confusion to open alarm. "I need something flat and rigid," he said. "Long as my arm." "Go." Nobody moved. 1 full second passed. Then Zeal turned and ran to the storage cabinet at the back of the room. He came back with a shelf panel, flat, rigid, just under a meter long. Colin took it without looking up. He called Sue over by name because she was the closest and had been watching carefully, and he talked her through holding the panel in place against Duro's limb while he secured it. He used more strips from his jacket and a length of cord from the bottom of his kit. Professor Valai had stopped reciting protocol. He was watching. The rest of the students were watching too. Some of them had their personal recording devices out. Zeal was writing in his journal with 3 of his 4 hands, the 4th still hovering near the shelf panel even though Colin no longer needed him there. Colin checked Prith, confirmed the suit was sealed and intact, and then walked back to Lena and checked her arm again. He adjusted the wrap slightly, asked her how it felt, and told her to keep holding it up. Then he sat down on the floor next to Duro, put one hand lightly on the Croth cadet's shoulder, and talked to him. He did not say medical things. He asked Duro about his home planet. What the landscape looked like. Whether the sky was a different color. He kept his voice level and unhurried. Duro answered slowly, and his low resonant distress sound gradually became quieter. The medical team arrived in 9 minutes. The lead medic, Counselor Fun, stopped in the doorway. He had been doing this work for a long time. He had walked into a lot of emergency rooms. He was not usually surprised by what he found. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at the improvised splint, looked at the wrapped arm, looked at the human sitting calmly on the floor talking about landscapes with an injured Croth cadet, and then he stepped inside and got to work. He did not say anything yet. But he kept looking. And when his scanner passed over the splint on Duro's limb and returned its assessment, he stopped moving entirely for a moment. Then he looked at Colin Drake with an expression that was harder to read than most. There were a lot of questions coming. Colin did not know that yet. He was still asking Duro about the color of the sky, #Deathworlder first aid shocks alien students, human methods leave the galaxy speechless. Part 3, methods the galaxy did not recognize. Counselor Fun was not a man who rushed. He had learned early in his career that rushing in medical work led to mistakes, and mistakes in medical work led to outcomes nobody wanted. He moved through Lab 7 with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had seen a great deal and was not easily rattled. He directed his 2 assistants to take over Duro's care, sent one back to the medical bay for a transport frame, and crouched beside the Croth cadet to do his own assessment. His scanner was a good one. The kind issued to senior medical officers, with full structural imaging and tissue analysis. He ran it slowly over Duro's injured limb, watching the display. The limb was broken in one place, cracked in 2 more. The displacement was significant. Under normal circumstances, a limb in this condition, unsupported for even a few minutes, would shift further out of position. Croth anatomy was dense and muscular, and muscles under pain response contracted hard. That contraction would pull the broken sections in different directions, turning one break into 3 and making surgical repair considerably more complex. The limb had not shifted. It had been held perfectly still. Fun looked at the improvised splint. It was made of a flat panel, strips of fabric, and a length of thin cord. The materials were not medical grade. They were not even close to medical grade. And yet the tension on the wrapping was correct. The panel was positioned to support the 2 main break sites. The cord had been tied in a way that distributed pressure evenly rather than concentrating it at any one point. He looked at Colin. Colin was now standing near the door, arms folded loosely, watching the medical team work with the relaxed interest of someone watching people do a job they already knew how to do. Lena stood beside him, her arms still elevated, the wrapped pad still in place. "You," Fun said. "Come here." Colin walked over. Fun pointed to the splint. "This stabilization. You did this?" "Yes," Colin said. "What did you use for the tension?" "Cord from my kit. Jacket strips for the padding. The panel was from the storage cabinet." Fun looked at the wrapping again. "Where did you train?" Colin appeared to consider the question. "First aid course at my school. I was about 13. And I recertified when I joined the cadet program. So twice, officially. I've also watched a fair amount of material online." There was a pause. "Online," Fun said. Educational videos. Some were from field medicine programs. Some were from civilian emergency courses. Fun was quiet for a moment. He ran his scanner over the wrap one more time, as if confirming what it had told him the first time. It told him the same thing. The stabilization was good. By any clinical standard, it was good. This technique, he said at last, is not in the Galactic Medical Standards database. I didn't know there was one of those, Colin said honestly. There is. It is the approved reference for all accredited medical response in cooperative space. It has 412 approved stabilization techniques. This is not one of them. Colin nodded. On Earth we call it a field splint. You use whatever you have nearby. The idea is that you immobilize the injury so it doesn't get worse before someone who actually knows what they're doing arrives. Fun looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the splint. Then he looked at Lena's arm, and at the way Colin had wrapped it. May I examine that? He asked her. Lena lowered her arm and held it out. Fun scanned it, checked the pad, pressed lightly on the edges of the wrap. The skin beneath was red and irritated, but the chemical had been flushed and the exposure had not penetrated to deeper tissue layers. The pressure wrap had done its job. You flushed the exposure site first, Fun said to Colin. Yes. With water. The standard protocol for chemical contact of this type is neutralizing mist. I didn't have neutralizing mist, Colin said. Water dilutes and removes surface contamination. It doesn't neutralize, but it reduces the concentration fast, which limits the depth of exposure. Good enough until proper treatment arrives. Fun said nothing. He finished his examination of Lena's arm, told her the medical team would do a full assessment in the bay, and stood up. Professor Valai had been standing near the back of the room the entire time. He had not spoken since the medical team arrived. He was a quiet observer by nature. 4 decades of teaching had given him a talent for watching and saying nothing until he had something worth saying. He walked toward Fun now and said it quietly, so the students nearby would not hear. How bad would the limb have been without the splint? Fun considered the question. The break pattern with the primary injury site, and with the muscle response I would expect under those conditions, there would have been secondary displacement within 3 to 5 minutes. Surgical repair time would have increased by several hours. Recovery time would have increased by 2 to 3 weeks minimum. Valai was quiet for a moment. And the arm. Without the flush and the pressure application, chemical penetration would have reached the second tissue layer. Permanent sensitivity damage was probable. Valai nodded slowly. The human did this with what he carries in his personal bag. Yes, Fun said. They both looked at Colin, who was now being approached by 2 of the student observers with questions he was answering in the same easy, unhurried tone he used for everything. The debrief happened 2 days later. It was attended by Professor Valai, Counselor Fun, 2 members of the academic board, and a small, very serious individual named Delegate Perro, who represented the Galactic Medical Standards Committee and had arrived on the unity of minds specifically because Fun's preliminary report had caused a significant amount of concern at the committee's main office. Colin sat across the table from all of them and answered their questions without any sign of nervousness. Delegate Perro had a list of the techniques Colin had used. He went through them one by one. Direct pressure on chemical exposure. Field splinting with improvised materials. Patient communication during distress. Scene organization with untrained bystanders. For each one he asked where it came from, how it was taught, and at what level of education it was considered standard. Colin answered clearly. The pressure technique was taught in basic first aid. The splinting method was taught in basic first aid. Patient communication during distress was part of basic first aid. Organizing bystanders was covered in the more advanced course, which most Earth schools offered as optional but which many students took anyway. Delegate Perro put down his list. These techniques, he said, are taught to children on your planet. To teenagers, mostly, Colin said. Some schools start earlier. As a required part of education. Required in most places. Optional in some. But even in the places where it's optional, a lot of people take it. Because it's useful. Perro looked at his list again. He looked at it for a long time. On our world, he said slowly, and on most worlds in the cooperative, emergency medical response is a professional field. Years of study. Licensing. Regulated practice. A member of the general public would not be expected, or permitted, to perform these techniques. Colin nodded. On Earth we figure that if something goes wrong, the professional might not be there. So you should know what to do yourself. The room was very quiet. Fun wrote something on his datapad. Valai looked at the table. The two academic board members exchanged a glance. Delegate Perro sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his datapad, opened a new document, and began writing what would eventually become a 60-page report. He did not know yet that it would be 60 pages. He did not know yet that it would be read by 800 million people. He was just writing the first line, which was the only thought he had at that moment that felt accurate enough to be worth recording. A human teenager knows more practical emergency medicine than most adults in the cooperative. He looked at Colin one more time, then looked back at his screen. He had a lot of work to do. #Deathworlder first aid shocks alien students. Human methods leave the galaxy speechless. Part 4, what the students began to understand. Lab 7 reopened on the fourth day after the incident. The coolant line had been replaced, the floor had been cleaned, and a new set of equipment lockers had been installed along the back wall. A small notice near the entrance read, in 12 languages, that the room had been inspected and cleared. Everything was back to normal. And yet the room was never quite what it had been before, because the students kept coming back to it in the evenings, not for any scheduled class, but because Colin and Lena were usually there doing their reading, and the questions had not stopped. They had, in fact, multiplied. Duro came every evening. His limb was in a proper medical support frame now, the kind issued by Counselor Fun's team, but he still moved carefully, settling himself into a large chair near the door that he had quietly claimed as his own. He did not always speak. He was content to sit and listen. But when he did speak, his questions were direct and specific, the way Croth questions always were. "Show me the rap again," he said on the first evening, holding out his good limb. Lena demonstrated on her own arm first, talking through each step. Duro watched with complete focus, the way a warrior watches a technique being demonstrated. When she finished, he asked her to do it again. She did. He asked Colin to explain the tension. Colin explained it. Duro nodded and said nothing more for a while, but his eyes did not leave their hands. He had already filed, through his home academic council, a formal request to introduce Earth first aid methodology to Croth physical education programs. He had written the request himself, in 3 pages, and had used the phrase, practical survival knowledge, 6 times because that was how Croth described something worth learning. Sue arrived on the second evening with a list. It was handwritten, which was unusual, because Vetheri almost always used their data pads. She had written it by hand because she had started it at 3 in the morning when she could not sleep and her data pad had been on the other side of the room. The list had 43 questions on it. She sat down across from Colin, placed the list on the table between them, and said, "I would like to go through these." "Sure," Colin said. She started at the top. The pressure technique on Lena's arm. "We do not use direct pressure on chemical exposure. We use neutralizing mist. The cooperative first response guidelines specifically instruct against pressure on chemical contact sites because of contamination spread risk." "That's a valid concern," Colin said. "If the pressure moves contamination to an area that hasn't been exposed, you've made it worse. That's why you flush first. The water removes most of the surface contamination before you apply pressure. After the flush, spread risk is low. And the pressure slows absorption into the tissue." Sue wrote that down. "This is not in the standard guidelines." "I know. But it works." Sue moved to the second question. "You improvised the splint using materials from the room. The cooperative guidelines say improvised splinting should only be attempted by trained medical personnel." "That makes sense if you have trained medical personnel available," Colin said. 11 minutes is a long time when a limb is trying to pull itself in 2 directions. Sue wrote that down too. She paused, pen above the paper, and looked at him. "You were not afraid of doing the wrong thing?" Colin thought about the question genuinely. "I was aware I might do something imperfect. But I was more afraid of doing nothing. Doing nothing was definitely going to make it worse." Doing something might not. So doing something was the better option. Sue stared at him. That is a very simple way to think about it. It's not complicated. For us it is, she said. We are taught that emergency medicine is for emergency medicine professionals. We are taught that attempting it without qualification causes harm. That is what we are told from the time we are children. Lena looked up from her book. We're taught the opposite. We're taught that waiting for someone else when you could be helping is the thing that causes harm. The room was quiet for a moment. Sue looked at Lena, then at Colin, then back at her list. You were both taught this as children, she said. Around 13, yes, Lena said. And before that? Basics earlier. How to stop bleeding. How to help someone who is choking. How to check if someone is breathing. That starts young. Sue put down her pen. She sat very still for a moment, which was a Vethery thing to do when processing something that required adjustment. Then she said, very quietly, on Vether, we would not know what to do if someone stopped breathing in front of us. What would you do? Colin asked. We would find someone who knew. Or we would wait for them to arrive. And if no one came in time? Sue did not answer. She picked her pen back up and kept writing. Professor Valai came by on the third evening. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the edge of the room and watched the session for a while before pulling a chair over and joining the group. By that point there were 11 students present, from 6 different species, and the conversation had expanded from the specific events in the lab to the broader question of what different species considered basic knowledge. A Sulkai student named Prith, the one who had been in the sealed suit during the incident and had come out unharmed, was explaining the Sulkai approach to personal safety. Sulkai lived in a carefully controlled atmospheric environment. Their ships and habitats were designed with multiple redundant systems. The answer to any emergency was, primarily, a technological one. You fixed the environment. You did not improvise. But what if the environment cannot be fixed quickly? Colin asked. Prith adjusted the settings on his suit, which was his way of showing discomfort. Then you wait for those who can fix it. And while you wait, you minimize your own actions. You do not make things worse by attempting repairs without training. What about injuries? People who are hurt while they wait. Prith was quiet for a moment. The medical team comes. And if they cannot come in time? The question sat in the air for a little while. Prith did not have an answer for it. Not because he was not intelligent, he was, clearly, a very capable student, but because the question itself had never been a real question in his world. The systems had always worked. The teams had always come. The backup plans had always been adequate. Valai spoke from the edge of the group. His voice was calm and measured. On most cooperative worlds, he said, the emergency systems are reliable enough that this question rarely becomes real. We have built our systems to prevent the gap. The gap between when the harm occurs and when trained help arrives. On Earth, Colin said, we also have those systems. But we grew up with animals that could kill you in that gap. And weather that could kill you. And a lot of other things. So we also trained people to fill the gap themselves. Valai nodded slowly. And that training became culture. I guess so. We don't think of it as training really. It's just what you know. Like knowing how to cook, or how to read a map. It's just stuff people know. Valai looked around the room. He looked at Sue, who was on page 6 of her list. He looked at Duro, who had been quietly practicing the rap technique on his own good limb for the past 20 minutes. He looked at Prith, who was still sitting with the unanswered question on his face. I have been teaching for 40 years, Valai said. I have taught students from 30 different species. I have never had a class session like the ones happening in this room right now. We're not even doing anything, Lena said, a little surprised. You are answering questions that most of my students have never thought to ask, Valai said. Because they did not know the answers could be different from what they were told. He stood up after a while and said goodnight. At the door he paused and looked back at the room, at the mix of species gathered around 2 humans who were simply answering questions as though the answers were obvious, which of them they were. He thought about what a different thing it was, to be taught that you were capable. Then he walked back to his own office, opened his data pad, and began drafting a proposal. He did not know yet exactly what shape it would take. He just knew he needed to write it down before the thought became less clear. Outside the window, space was dark and full of distance. Inside Lab 7, Sue reached question 29 on her list, and Colin answered it the same way he had answered all the others, simply, directly, and without any awareness that he was saying something the galaxy had not heard before. #Deathworlder first aid shocks alien students, human methods leave the galaxy speechless. Part 5, what the galaxy took home. Delegate Pero worked for 9 days straight. He was not the kind of person who worked 9 days straight. He was a careful, methodical official who believed in proper rest and scheduled review periods. He had held his position with the Galactic Medical Standards Committee for 22 years and had written dozens of reports, none of which had required 9 consecutive days of effort. Most of them had required a few hours and a standard template. This one was different. It started as a straightforward incident review. A coolant line failure on an academic vessel. 3 students injured. Medical team response time within acceptable parameters. Outcomes positive. End of report. That was the report he expected to write when he first boarded the Unity of Minds. But then he had sat across the table from Colin Drake and asked his questions, and the answers had done something to the report that he could not undo. They had made it larger. More complicated. Full of implications that he kept following down into new sections, new subsections, new recommendations that each required their own supporting arguments. The final report was 61 pages. The executive summary at the front was 3 sentences long, because Pero had found that the people who received his reports rarely read past the executive summary, and he wanted to make sure they could not pretend they had missed the point. The 3 sentences said, "The unprompted emergency intervention by Cadet Colin Drake of Earth, performed using knowledge acquired during standard adolescent civilian education, exceeded the outcomes expected from approved first response protocol in 3 measurable categories. These categories were stabilization time, prevention of secondary injury, and patient communication under distress. This committee recommends an immediate formal review of whether universal baseline emergency training, modeled on or informed by Earth civilian standards, should be a required element of cooperative educational curricula." He sent the report to his supervisor. His supervisor read the executive summary, opened the full document, read 40 pages of it in one sitting, and forwarded it to the Standards Committee chair. The chair read it, called an emergency session of the committee, and at the end of that session forwarded it to the Cooperative Academic Oversight Board with a cover note that said simply, "Please read this before our meeting." At some point in that process, the report was also sent to the public academic network. Nobody was certain who did that. Pero suspected his assistant, who had strong opinions about institutional transparency. His assistant, when asked, said it had seemed like the right thing to do. Pero could not find a compelling argument against this, so he let it go. The report appeared on the public network on a Tuesday. By Wednesday it had been viewed by 40 million people. By Friday that number was 230 million. By the end of the following week, 800 million individuals across 47 species had read at least the executive summary, and a significant portion of them had read much more. The responses were varied, which was to be expected when 800 million individuals were involved. The Croth response was, in many ways, the most straightforward. The Croth valued practical capability above most other things. Their academic councils reviewed the report, discussed it for approximately 3 days, and then issued a joint statement saying that Earth emergency methodology would be introduced into physical education programs at all levels within the next academic cycle. Duro, from his recovery room on the Unity of Minds, sent a message to his home council adding his personal endorsement, which was not necessary but which he felt was appropriate. The council acknowledged his message with a formal note of thanks that was longer and warmer than council notes usually were. The Vetheri response was more complicated. The Vetheri were meticulous people. They did not change their educational practices quickly. They had committees for reviewing committee decisions. Sue, who had by this point completed all 43 questions on her original list and started a second list, submitted her own analysis to the Vetheri Academic Standards Body as a student paper. It was 17 pages long. The final paragraph said, "We have been teaching our children to wait for help. Earth teaches their children to be the help. The outcomes in this incident suggest we should consider whether our approach is actually keeping our children safer or simply keeping them more comfortable with their own helplessness. The paper was reviewed, flagged for further discussion, passed to a subcommittee, and placed on a formal review calendar for the following year. This was, for the Vethery, extremely fast action. The Sulci response was largely statistical. Their analysts ran probability models on the outcomes in Lab 7 and produced a document showing that Collins' interventions had reduced the probability of serious long-term injury by a factor of 3. They then ran models on how often similar scenarios occurred across cooperative space and produced a second document showing how many such injuries per year could theoretically be prevented if the general population had comparable training. The second document had a very large number in it. The Sulci sent both documents to the Standards Committee without comment, because the numbers said everything that needed to be said. The Marishi Academic Board called 2 emergency sessions and then a third one that was technically a regular session but felt like an emergency one. Professor Valli submitted his proposal through official channels during the second session. The proposal was for an optional module, 1 semester, available to all students on all cooperative academic vessels, covering basic emergency response using Earth civilian methodology as its foundation. Optional was the word he used carefully and deliberately, because he knew that required was too large a step for one proposal to carry. But optional could become standard. He had seen it happen before. The proposal was seconded by 6 other faculty members before the session ended. Colin found out the report had gone public when Lena sent him a message that read, "Check the network. You went viral. Again." He was eating breakfast. He was having a bowl of something the cafeteria called a grain blend, which tasted approximately like oatmeal if the oatmeal had never met actual oats. He read Lena's message, looked up the report on his data pad, saw the view count, ate another spoonful of grain blend, and went to class. On the way he passed Zeal in the corridor. Zeal was carrying a physical printout of the report under 2 of his forearms. He had printed it because he wanted to annotate it, and he had found that he annotated more carefully on paper than on screen. He had already annotated 20 pages. There were small neat notes in the margins in Vethery script. "You have read it?" Zeal asked. "Yeah," Colin said. "You seem unaffected." Colin thought about it for a moment. "My mom taught me the pressure wrap when I was 12, he said. "After I fell off the roof of our garage and she decided I should know what to do the next time." Zeal processed this carefully. "You fell off a roof?" "Yeah. And the response to this event was to teach you emergency medicine." "Her response," Colin said. "I mostly just wanted to climb back up." Zeal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "On Vether, if a child fell from a height, the response would be to ensure the height was made safer. To add barriers. Remove the risk." "We do that too," Colin said. "But we also accept that you can't always do that. And that sometimes you fall anyway. So you should know what to do when you land." He said goodbye and kept walking toward his class. Zeal stood in the corridor and watched him go, and then he opened his journal, not the printout, the actual journal, the one he had been keeping since the first day, and turned to a fresh page. He had written 12 pages in the first week. He had written 40 more since the incident. He had not expected, when he submitted his request for a human academic partner, that the experience would change the way he thought about his own species. That had not been part of the research plan. He wrote at the top of the new page, "The human did not understand why we found his actions remarkable. He did not find them remarkable himself. He found them ordinary." He paused and thought about that for a moment. Then he wrote, "This is because on his world, being capable of helping someone is considered ordinary. It is expected. It is part of what a person is supposed to be. Not a special skill. Not a professional qualification. Just something you know." He underlined the last 4 words. Just something you know. He closed the journal and walked to his own class, moving through the wide blue-lit corridors of the Unity of Minds with the slightly distracted look of someone rearranging a large number of thoughts. Across the galaxy, in 47 school systems, committees were opening new files. Some of them were moving fast and some of them were moving slowly, and some of them were still arguing about whether movement was necessary at all. But they were all moving, because 800 million people had read a 61-page report about a young man who had stopped a Croth cadet's injury from getting worse using fabric from his own jacket and a shelf panel from a storage cabinet. Nobody had told Colin that any of this was happening. He would not have been surprised exactly, but he would not have fully understood the scale of it either, because from where he was standing, he had not done anything that anyone back home would have considered worth writing 800 million words about. He had just done what his mother taught him to do when someone needed help. On Earth, that was the whole point.